Tunku Ismail Ibni Sultan Ibrahim, the Crown Prince of Johor, better known as TMJ, and the current regent of the Johor state, has just finished his hour-long special press conference with the press and in front of the FAM executive committee and high-ranking officials. And in the range of topics that was discussed, two hot-button issues were raised by him. First was obviously the one that has been on everyone's lips in Malaysia over the past 2 months, ever since FIFA threw the rule book at FAM over the alleged falsification of documents, and also on the state of Malaysian football. And what has transpired so far has given some answers, but in all honesty, I guess I wouldn't say given how the questions were raised, but there were still a few things that needed further probing, needed further asking. The first one lies in the number of agents and the number of recommended players who approached TMJ at the start of this Harimau Malaya project, when he was looking for players with Malaysian blood who have the potential to represent the country in international football. And the numbers that were raised were rather eyebrow-raising. He mentioned that there were quite a number of agents who approached him and possibly the Tengku Buddha of Pahang over those players. And out of the 29 recommendations that were made, 7 were eventually chosen. And those 7 also now happen to be the ones who are now suspended by FIFA following the falsification of documents scandal. And as a result of the rule book being thrown at FAM in late September, what has happened is those 7 players now still currently can't play football at all. They cannot be involved in training, they cannot be involved in official football activities, and they are currently all suspended by their clubs pending the appeal process that FM has already filed and is awaiting verdict on the 30th of October, which is in a few days' time. And if FIFA upholds the original sanctions that it has imposed to FM and those 7 players, just a recap on that, the 7 affected players are John Irazabal, Facundo Garces, Gabriel Palermo, Hector Havel, João Figueiredo, Emmanuel Machucha, and Rodrigo Hogaldo. And those 7 players were each fined 2,000 Swiss francs and immediate ban lasting a year. Or, if the appeal is eventually successful, they could resume playing as soon as however long or short the ban is. And meanwhile, FAM are also given a huge fine of 450,000 Swiss francs, which is close to more than $1 million Malaysian ringgit. Now, as a result of this alleged falsification of documents, what has conspired was, in everyone's lips, is how did these 7 get their Malaysian heritage from? And FIFA further revealed that they had those documents that they had gotten elsewhere that were proven to be false compared to the documents that were initially submitted to FIFA. So here lies quite a number of questions that, while TMJ actually answered a number of them, but some of the answers actually raised a few more questions. First, the type of agents, which I already explained. Who were these agents? Why did they have an interest in promoting their players to TMJ, Harimau Malaya, and the Football Association of Malaysia to help them to play for the national team? Let's put it this way, because this is quite different from the likes of Dion Kus, Brendan Gunn, Matthew Davis, Lavelle Corbin Ong, and even Malaysia's latest foreign-born foreign-born heritage player, Richard Chin. All these players that I've just mentioned, or at least had either a parent who is Malaysian or a grandparent who has Malaysian heritage. Malaysian or Malayan, because I will explain later the era and the context which I have raised in the previous video when I talk about this issue. Then, those 7 players, there were 29 recommended players. How did those 7 eventually get chosen? And those questions, from those answers that TMJ gave, I guess it all lies in the process. The initial process now we know is these agents propose those players to TMJ, FAM, and Harimau Malaya. What happened next? What was Harimau Malaya CEO Rob Friend's role in this? And thereafter, what did FM do as the overall governing body who could sanction or reject those 7 players? And what about NRD, whose role, as was described by the Malaysian Home Minister, was more towards the documentation put in good faith based on their laws and statutes that are provided within the Malaysian Constitution. So, this is the first question. What happened in between the first and the NRD approval that led to those 7 being approved as Malaysian heritage players? I think the first part is known. The interest of these agents and who remains a mystery. Who could they be? What are their intentions or agendas? Then there is the second part. It is, how did those 7 players get selected? It is possible that those 22 whom they recommended, they were eliminated because they were found that it's possibly the great-grandparent or the great-great-great-grandparent who had Malayan blood, but these were from the bygone centuries, and it's very hard to prove even with the technology that we have in this present age, because even with the current technology, there are limitations, and many events could have happened way before the first internet was even founded in the 70s or 80s. I mean the first internet, or 90s rather. So therein lies the question, whose birth certificates are valid? Is it the ones that NRD submitted to FIFA, or the ones that FIFA managed to retrieve throughout the investigation process? Obviously, based on the logic, there should be a case of that FIFA's ones were valid but NRD's ones were not. But here is a big but, and this is not going to be from a football angle, but more on the historical angle. And this I've said once in a previous video when I talk about this falsification of documents scandal. We have to remember that the grandparents of those 7 affected players were born in the 1930s, and the 1930s and 1940s were turbulent decades around the world. It's not just about the Second World War. There was also the Spanish Civil War that affected the Spanish-born players, and of course for those who are born, the 2 who are born in South America, 2 or 3, there is the civil wars, the dictatorial coups, or other things that could have happened in those periods in South America, because South America admittedly was largely unaffected by the Second World War, but there were also political tensions that were in South America during that period, and crucially the technology that was used. While Eric Doll here could say that PSSI had gotten legitimate birth certificate of their foreign-born players who play for the Garudas through the Dutch citizenship and all these things, I do suspect this. The best answers when it comes to the birth certificate issue may not exactly be from the football side. It is also possible that birth certificates could be forged, or worse still, because one thing, over time, given the old birth certificates that were done on paper, They do get old, they do wilt, they do crumble, they do have all these tattered edges, or even when you fold them, it gets wrinkled. It is easily where the ink will fade because it was all pen and paper during those era. And so there were two possibilities. The original documents could have not been the ones that were there due to a few factors. One, natural cause. As time goes, as the years go by, the papers age and the ink fades. The paper is not as clean as it was used to be, unless special preservation tools were used to keep those birth certificates safe. Secondly, what if, like in the case of the Second World War and the Spanish Civil War, what if the safes that were used to store the birth certificates, whether it's in the province or the districts, were destroyed during the Second World War? What could have happened then? And where did those electronic registration of these birth certificates retrieve from? Where did it begin from? Did it begin from the 1800s? Did it begin from the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, or even the 1930s? 1930s is still possible, but it takes a very dedicated person to have kept these documents in such pristine shape for close to a century to be passed down to the present generation. So, in FIFA's case, do they have the expertise of the Argentine, Dutch, and Spanish experts, and even the Brazilians, the heritage experts, to show that what these birth certificates have are legitimate or otherwise? Because ultimately, I think TMG did not say this, but only those who are in the country will know how these birth certificate records are being kept, how this documentation were being done. Did FIFA overlook this? Because all the blame is on FAM and National Registration Department for not doing it. And while it is possible that this is kept in good faith, I'm going back to that possibility that what if FIFA had erred on that birth certificate issue itself? Obviously, they had mentioned about the Dutch record keeping system, which, if true, will have ruled one of them out already, Hector Havel, who was born in the Netherlands. But then again, what if the Dutch records from the 1930s and 1940s were not as well kept as intended? Or they were only mentioned when their son was born and all that? Because let's remember a few things. It is still possible that they could have been born in some part of Malaysia, or they could have a grand uncle or grandparent who could be switched to become a grandparent. There is also a possibility, because the João Figueiredo photo that was shown on his Instagram of late, I can recognize at least one face who looks a possible Malaysian Chinese. So that link is possibly there. And I'm going to use a different context from personal experience. I have encountered a snodgrass in Singapore. Yes, the former Premier League footballer Robert Snodgrass. And there is actually a snodgrass in Singapore whom I encountered years ago. Not in football. That's not in football. It's in a different setting which I will not specify here. And when I had a brief chat with this snodgrass Singapore, who is a Singaporean, but he's obviously Mat Salleh or Ang Mo, he said this. He mentioned that the majority of this Snodgrass family has a heritage in the UK, in Scotland, where Robert Snodgrass used to play for the Scottish national team. But the majority of the Snodgrass family is currently residing in America. So, in this context where it's concerned, this Snodgrass, yes, I'm going to use this Snodgrass as a very specific example on how the diaspora could be so wide that it's highly possible that Figueiredo could have had relatives who have this lineage that is brought down to be eligible for him to represent Malaysia. And this is also highly possible for the likes of Hector Havel, for even the rest of the other 5 players. It's still possible, and FIFA could still overturn this verdict, although it's very rare, but the Court of Arbitration of Sports is likely to overturn this. Now, having used this Snodgrass example, now I'm going to go back to your Figueredo. They don't look like they're Malaysian. It is obvious, but lineage is quite broad, and the diaspora, the family units, can be spread to all over the world, especially with globalization in the past few decades, or even earlier during the colonial era, where natives of a certain island could have gone elsewhere, could have gone back to the colonizer's country, or to a different country to find a better living. And in whichever mode of transport that was relevant and prevalent during that era. So, using those historical contexts, I'm going to say this. There's a high maybe that these seven could still have uncles, grand-aunties who are related to them, who are Malayan or Malaysian ancestry. So, where this is concerned, those agents who dug it out were able to spot this aspect of the ancestry. And even though FIFA had said grandparent, parents, what if there's an uncle? He's also, that becomes, although it's not a direct admission of heritage, but there is a plausibility somewhere in the family tree. And I think the family tree is the critical context that is missing from both FIFA and NRD. So, for FIFA's fault, it is highly possible, unless the Dutch, the Germans, the Spanish, the Argentinian, and the Brazilian heritage curators are able to verify how their birth certificate documentation works, especially from the pre-World War II era. Because without this context, we do not know how this paper, which is very brittle and more prone to adverse weather, especially with environmental changes, could affect the record keeping, and whether the war or the physical conflicts through civil wars could have caused damage or a loss of records as well. I think this is where I'm not the expert there, but I do think the weightage is not sufficient, because this expands a bit beyond the administration of the day and all that. So FIFA may have gotten a rather falsified version. But given that they're the world governing body, they do have their sources. But I do hope those historians from those countries I mentioned will be able to provide a better context where birth certificates and record keepings are concerned. Because this is something Southeast Asia we do not know. And then there is the case of fighting to the end. Because if this fact, this possible theory that can be proven here, then FAM through their legal team, especially with their league counsel, who is best known for fighting for the FA and the players to be eligible to compete in the World Cup finals, on their side, those 7 players, then they have a very good chance of overturning this verdict right up to the very end, even if the FIFA Appeals Committee upholds the original decision on the 30th of October. And TMJ has already put this commitment that he has already spoken to all those 7 affected players. He's backing them all the way. He's going to provide for them. He still believes in them as Malaysians. And even though he has also stated that he is prepared for the worst. Now, and crucially, TMJ also says something where this topic is still concerned. It is continuing this process of finding such heritage players until FIFA decide in their through Gianni Infantino that they have to adjust the criteria for eligibility of the naturalization process. Because I think it's not just Malaysia. Indonesia had the best one. Singapore is pure naturalization, but the heritage process began with Indonesia. So from Indonesia, now Malaysia, Laos, Vietnam. Vietnamese is more naturalization at this moment, but heritage in Tam Van Lam, there are still, I think, at least a few more countries. Only Myanmar, Brunei have never used a heritage player. So majority are using this, and in light of that, FIFA may look to adjust it because it's not just Southeast Asia, but almost the entire world. Until FIFA decides to adjust the criteria for naturalizing the players, whether it's through the 5-year residency, which I think will still be there, or crucially the heritage aspect, then TMJ has already said that this process will continue until, I believe, Malaysia reaches a level where it can depend on 100 Arif Aimans to be the backbone of the national system, from the senior level all the way down to the youth level. And this is probably my interpretation on what he says. And looking at all this, looking at this aspect, I think especially the falsification of documents scandal, some answers are there now. The clues are there. The questions are, I think as I will summarize, who are those agents? Why do they have the interest in recommending players to play for this particular national team? Especially unlike the case of Kuz, Davis, Gunn, or Richard Chin, those 7, how did they get their Malaysian ancestry from? Whether legitimate or otherwise. And whether FIFA's ability to draw from them, is it as equally flawed as NRB's? Because if FIFA has proven that it is, during its verdict, that it said that he has gotten those documents carefully, what if FIFA is flawed? If FIFA is flawed, then I'm going to say something here. If FIFA is flawed, then this gets very interesting, because it is not about the registration process of Malaysia that's in question. It's about how record keeping are being done to preserve it, and when it is lost, how is it going to be replaced or replicated to show that this family tree is valid? And that's where I think that loophole still exists. And as long as FIFA is not able to prove directly on that, especially the grandparent part, because technology has evolved so much that unless they're able to show some record keeping that this is really genuine, and when the historical records can say, yes, this is a genuine document from that era, otherwise it's pretty hard to tell that it is or otherwise. And overall, I think FIFA did not give as complete its judgment as it would have liked. Spelling errors notwithstanding, the actual births notwithstanding, but still question marks also on the FIFA side. But I think TMJ has said enough that these agents probably know something, and probably will try to link a certain way to show their heritage, which is actually may not be as direct as is claimed, but has some substantial proof that there's some heritage, Malayan heritage, in their ancestors, especially I think in the grandparents level. It may not be the grandparent, it could be a grand uncle or a grand auntie, even though it's illegal. But what if they could have worked that around instead? Maybe. Yes, there are still a number of maybes in overall after this. But what is clear is, even if the sanctions are upheld, even at the CS level, TMJ has already said he's still going to be there. He's still going to do his best to try to keep Malaysian football up at a good level as long as he's involved. Even though his current official commitments as the region of Johor do not allow him to be involved in FAM 24/7, which is also true. Otherwise, he'll need 48 or 72-hour days, which is never going to be the case in human history. So, on that part, the maybes, the possibilities of maybe FIFA may have done and may have added, we don't know about the record keepings of those affected countries where the players originally come from. Are they really valid, or is there some kind of forgery involved in the past that has led to this? We do not know all this, and these are they are still unanswered questions. Although it's very clear that the process on how it has begun is there. Now it's about whether FIFA has made an error itself, which is actually a possibility, and I suspect the FM League Council will have tried to pick on this point. Still, I think it's going to be interesting, and we could see a few more of these once everything comes into light in the eventual final judgment at the Court of Arbitration of Sports, or CAS.